The chandeliers of the Royal Astoria Ballroom threw diamonds of light across 300 of the most powerful people in the country, and not one of them noticed the woman quietly slipping her hand beneath the table to press against her stomach. Althea Thorne had learned, over 6 years of marriage, how to disappear in plain sight. She had learned to smile at the right moment, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to stand exactly 2 steps behind her husband so the cameras would always frame him first. Tonight, in a gown the color of frozen champagne, she looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine. She felt like a woman standing on a trapdoor, waiting to find out when the floor would open. She didn't know it would be tonight. She didn't know it would be now. Across the ballroom, her husband, Kaelis Thorne, heir to a shipping and finance empire so vast that entire countries owed him favors, climbed the small stage where the annual Thorne Foundation Christmas Gala always reached its emotional peak. Every year, he stood beneath that same golden arch of lights and thanked the room for their generosity. Every year, the cameras loved him for it. Tall, silver-templed, a jaw that looked carved rather than born, Kaelis Thorne had spent a decade cultivating the image of a devoted husband and a benevolent king of industry. Tonight, he wasn't going to give a speech about generosity. Tonight, he had something else planned. "Althea," he said into the microphone, and his voice rolled out warm and easy over the crowd, the voice of a man who had never once in his life doubted that the room was his. "Come up here, sweetheart. I want everyone to see you." A ripple of soft laughter, of approving applause. Someone's grandmother sighed and said, "Aren't they just beautiful together?" to the stranger beside her. Nobody in that ballroom had the faintest idea that they were about to watch a woman's entire life detonate in real time, on camera, in front of the very people she had spent years trying to impress. Althea rose. She smoothed the front of her gown out of habit, not out of vanity, and made her way toward the stage with the practiced grace of a woman who had walked toward her husband in public 1,000 times before. She climbed the 2 steps. She turned to face the room, the way she always did, angling her body just slightly so the light caught her jawline the way the photographers preferred. And Kaelis Thorne smiled at her the way he always smiled, warm, easy, camera-ready. Then he reached into his jacket. At first, half the room assumed it was a ring box. A proposal renewal, maybe, something sentimental and sweet for the holidays, the kind of moment that would trend online for a week. A woman near the front actually gasped in delighted anticipation and grabbed her husband's arm. But it wasn't a ring box. It was a folder, cream-colored, embossed with the seal of a law firm that half the room recognized immediately, because it was the most expensive divorce practice in the state. He held it out to her. "Althea," he said, and his voice didn't waver, didn't soften, didn't do anything a decent man's voice might do in that moment. "I think it's time we were honest with everyone." The room went very quiet. Somewhere in the back, a camera flash went off, then another, then a dozen at once, because every photographer in that ballroom had just realized, in the same half-second, that they were about to capture the photo of the year. "A wife," Kaelis said, still smiling for the cameras, still smiling like a man cutting a ribbon at a hospital opening, "is an asset, until she becomes a liability." He let the folder fall into her hands. Nobody breathed. Somewhere in that frozen, glittering silence, Althea Thorne's fingers curled instinctively, not around the folder, but low, against her stomach, beneath the fabric of a gown that had been altered twice in the last month to hide what she hadn't told a single living soul. She was 6 weeks pregnant, and she was standing in front of 300 witnesses, being divorced on camera by the only man who was supposed to protect her. She did not cry. That was the detail that would later confuse people. When the footage went viral, when strangers across the world dissected her face frame by frame looking for the tears that never came. She did not cry, because some part of her, the part that had learned, slowly, painfully, over 6 years, to read the temperature of a room before it turned cold, some part of her had already known this moment was coming. Not the details, not the cameras, not the folder, not the cruelty dressed up as a toast. But she had known, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color, that something in her marriage had been rotting for a very long time. She looked at him, just looked, And then she turned and walked off that stage with her spine straight and her chin level. And 300 of the wealthiest people in the country watched a woman disappear into the crowd with more dignity than the man who just humiliated her would ever manage to fake again. What none of them saw, what only one man in that entire ballroom noticed, was the small cream envelope that slipped from her clutch as she pushed through the crowd toward the exit, landing softly on the marble floor beneath an unattended champagne table. Soren Vale saw it fall. He was not, technically, supposed to be at the gala at all. He'd come as a favor to an old business partner, standing near the edges of the room in a dark suit that made him look less like a guest and more like a man who was used to watching rooms rather than being watched by them. He was younger than Cassian by almost a decade, quieter, the kind of wealthy that didn't need cameras to confirm it. His money came from something structural and unglamorous, logistics and infrastructure, the invisible architecture that kept half the eastern seaboard's shipping running on time. He didn't do galas. He didn't do speeches. He watched, and he watched Althea Thorne's envelope hit the floor, and he watched no one else notice. He crossed the room in a handful of unhurried steps, bent, and lifted it before a waiter's tray could crush it underfoot. He didn't open it right away. He wasn't a man who opened other people's things without reason. But something about the weight of the room, the whispers already spreading like ink through water, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" made him tuck the envelope into his jacket rather than chase after her to return it. It wasn't until he was in the back of his car, 20 minutes later, city lights sliding across the windows, that he opened it. Inside was a single black-and-white ultrasound image. A tiny curled shape, a flickering heartbeat frozen mid-pulse, a date stamped in the corner from 6 days earlier. Soren Vale sat very still for a long moment. He understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man who spent his life reading contracts for the sentence that didn't belong, that Cassian Thorne had just publicly humiliated his pregnant wife on television, and did not know she was pregnant at all. He also understood something else, something that took longer to surface but arrived with the same certainty. A woman who had just been discarded that visibly, that publicly, by a man that powerful, was not merely getting divorced. She was in danger. He didn't know why he believed that yet. He would later tell people it was instinct, though instinct wasn't really the word for it. It was pattern recognition, the same skill that had made him a fortune reading supply chains and predicting collapses before they happened. Something about the speed of what he'd just witnessed, the rehearsed cruelty of it. Men who wanted a quiet divorce did not stage the humiliation in front of 300 witnesses and a dozen cameras. Men who did that wanted something on record. They wanted a story the world would believe before the woman had a chance to tell her own. That kind of theater took planning. Soren picked up his phone and called a number he rarely used, a private security firm he retained for corporate matters, men who were very good at being invisible. "I need someone on a woman named Althea Thorne," he said, his voice low and even in the dark of the car. "Tonight. Now. Quiet. She's not to know. I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she talks to. And I want to know immediately if anyone besides me takes an interest in her." The man on the other end asked the obvious question. "Why?" Soren looked down at the ultrasound in his hand, at the small, ghostly shape that no one else in that glittering ballroom had known existed. "Because I don't think her husband knows what he just threw away," he said. "And I don't think whoever's really behind this wants her found alive to explain it." He didn't know. Yet, how right he was. 3 days after the gala, Althea Thorne stood in line at a Department of Motor Vehicles office in a strip mall 20 minutes from the penthouse she could no longer legally call home, holding a manila folder of documents and trying very hard not to shake. She had not slept properly since Christmas Eve. She had spent the days since in a hotel room paid for on a card that, mercifully, still worked, watching the footage of her own humiliation loop across every entertainment channel in the country. Her face frozen mid-turn 1,000 times over, captioned with headlines that ranged from cruel to merely clinical. Billionaire Cassian Thorne divorces wife on live television. Ice Queen Althea's silent exit goes viral. Nobody had asked her a single question. Nobody had wondered, even once, whether there might be more to the story than a cold woman getting exactly what a room full of strangers assumed she deserved. She had told no one about the baby. Not her lawyer, not her sister, not a single soul. Some private, wounded animal part of her needed to hold that secret a little longer, needed one true thing in her life that hadn't yet been picked apart by strangers on the internet. Today she was simply trying to renew her passport, because some quiet, practical part of her brain, the part that hadn't fully caught up to the wreckage of the last 72 hours, had decided that she needed to leave. Somewhere far away, somewhere the cameras couldn't follow. The woman at the counter, mid-50s, kind eyes behind reading glasses, typed Althea's information into the system with the bold efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Then she stopped typing. She frowned at the screen. She typed again, more slowly this time, double-checking each letter. She said, and her voice had changed, gone careful in a way that made the hair rise on the back of Althea's neck. Can you confirm your date of birth for me again? Althea confirmed it. The woman's frown deepened. She picked up her phone and murmured something to a supervisor in the back office, low enough that Althea couldn't make out the words, only the tone of someone reporting something that wasn't supposed to be possible. A second employee came out, then a third. They conferred over the monitor in hushed, uneasy voices, glancing up at Althea every few seconds like she was something that had wandered into the building by mistake. The supervisor finally said, and she said it the way you'd speak to someone standing near the edge of a very tall building, "I'm going to need you to come with me to a private room, please." "Why?" Althea asked. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "What's wrong?" The supervisor hesitated. And then, because there was simply no gentle way to say what the system was telling her, she said it plainly. "According to federal records, you're deceased. Your death was recorded 18 months ago." For a moment, Althea genuinely believed she had misheard. "I'm sorry," she said. That's not possible. I'm standing right here. I understand that. I'm not saying, I don't think you," the supervisor exhaled, clearly out of her depth. "I've never seen this before. Your social security number shows deactivated. Your birth certificate record shows voided. Your driver's license in our system shows inactive, pending an identity investigation that was apparently closed and confirmed 18 months ago." She looked up, and for the first time there was something like fear in her eyes, the fear of a woman who processed thousands of ordinary documents a year and had just found herself holding one that made no sense at all. "Whoever you are, the system says you don't exist." Later, Althea would not be able to fully reconstruct the next hour. She remembered sitting in a small back office with fluorescent lighting, a cup of water she never drank going warm in her hand, a young clerk on the phone with someone at a state records office, repeating numbers, repeating her name, getting the same answer every single time. "No match found. Record terminated. Please advise." She remembered thinking, with a strange, floating detachment, someone did this on purpose. Because paperwork didn't erase itself. Systems didn't spontaneously decide a living woman had died a year and a half ago. Someone with resources, real resources, the kind of resources that could reach into federal databases and state records and quietly, cleanly delete a person, had done this to her. And they had done it 18 months ago. 18 months ago, she had still been married, still living in the penthouse, still, as far as she'd known, simply a wife whose husband traveled too much and came home too tired to talk. 18 months ago, someone had already been planning to erase her. She left the DMV without a passport, without answers, and with a cold, crawling certainty that the humiliation on that stage on Christmas Eve had not been the beginning of her nightmare. It had only been the moment the curtain finally lifted on one that had been building around her for a year and a half, one careful, silent brick at a time. If you're the kind of person who believes the people you trust most could never do something like this to you, stay with this story, because it's about to get a lot darker, and it's about to prove you wrong in ways you won't see coming. Drop a comment right now with the words "I'm watching," so we know you're still here when the truth finally breaks. And if this story is already under your skin, hit subscribe, because the next twist changes everything you think you understand about who the real villain is. The apartment came next. Althea drove, in a rental, because her own car, it turned out, had been quietly repossessed 2 weeks earlier under a lien she'd never signed, to the building on Lexington where she and Cassian had lived together for the first 3 years of their marriage, before the move to the penthouse. It was a modest place by his standards, a two-bedroom she had once loved for its crown molding and its view of a small park, a place that had been, briefly, entirely hers before Cassian's world swallowed it. She still owned it. Or she had, once. It had been her name on the deed, a wedding gift from her late father, the one piece of property in her life that had never belonged to the Thorne Empire. The doorman, a heavy-set man named Gerald who had known her for years, looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place when she walked in. "Mrs. Thorne," he said carefully, I didn't expect to see you. The new owners just moved their furniture in last week." Althea felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. "New owners," she repeated. "The unit sold in the spring." "I assumed you knew. The paperwork came through management, all very straightforward. I remember because it was one of the fastest closings I've seen in this building. Cash offer. I never sold that apartment." Gerald's kind, weathered face folded into confusion, and then something more careful, more guarded, the look of a man realizing he might be standing in the middle of something far bigger than a doorman's job description covered. "I only know what came across my desk, Mrs. Thorne. I'm sorry. Would you like me to pull the paperwork?" The paperwork, when a records clerk finally produced it 2 days later after Althea hired a lawyer specifically to chase it down, bore a signature that was almost hers. Close enough to fool a title company. Close enough to fool a notary who swore, under later questioning, that he distinctly remembered the woman who'd signed in his office, a woman who was not Althea, wearing sunglasses indoors and giving a rushed excuse about a migraine. Her bank accounts told the same story in a different key. 3 of the 4 accounts she'd held in her maiden name. Accounts from before the marriage. Accounts Cassian had never had access to, had been drained and closed over the previous 14 months, the withdrawals routed through a cascade of shell transfers that even her lawyer, a sharp, tired woman named Priya Okafor, admitted looked less like fraud and more like a professional operation. "Whoever did this," Priya said, sliding a folder of bank statements across her desk, "did not do this casually. This isn't an ex-husband skimming money out of spite, Althea. This is structured, led. Somebody spent real time and real expertise making sure that if anyone ever went looking, they'd hit dead ends at every turn. Cassian doesn't have the patience for this," Althea said quietly. And even as she said it, she realized it was true in a way she hadn't let herself admit until now. Her husband was many things: vain, cold, ambitious to the point of cruelty, but he had never once, in 6 years, shown the kind of meticulous, invisible discipline this would have required. He liked applause. He liked stages. Whoever had done this had done it entirely in the dark, and had done it so well that an entire government database now insisted Althea Thorne did not exist. "Then who?" Priya asked. Althea didn't have an answer. Not yet. But 3 floors above the parking garage where she'd left her rental car, unseen behind the tinted windows of a black SUV parked across the street, a man in a dark coat lowered a pair of binoculars and made a phone call. "She's asking the right questions now," he said. "Faster than we expected. She's not supposed to survive long enough to get answers." The voice on the other end replied, flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who had said far more frightening things in far calmer tones. "Handle it quietly. No cameras this time." Even the hospital had betrayed her. It was Priya's idea to pull Althea's medical records, a routine step in untangling the mess of forged documents and vanished assets, the kind of due diligence a good lawyer does automatically. What came back should have taken an afternoon. Instead, it took 4 days, 3 phone calls to hospital administration, and 1 increasingly tense meeting with a records custodian who kept apologizing without explaining why. When the file finally arrived, Althea read it once, then read it again, certain she was misunderstanding something. The medical history attached to her name included 2 pregnancies she had never had. One listed as a miscarriage at 11 weeks, 4 years ago. One listed as a voluntary termination, 2 years ago, at a clinic in a state she had never once set foot in. She had experienced neither. There had been no pregnancies in her marriage before this one. Not one, not ever. Not in 6 years of trying quietly, hopefully, and then not trying at all as the marriage grew colder and colder. She would have remembered. A woman remembers a miscarriage. A woman remembers a termination. These were not the kinds of things that slipped a person's mind. And yet there they were, typed into a hospital's permanent record under her name, her date of birth, her insurance number, signed off by a physician whose name meant nothing to her, at a clinic she had never visited. This isn't a clerical error, Priya said grimly, spreading the documents across her desk like a hand of cards nobody wanted to be dealt. Someone built a false medical history for you. A detailed one. This takes access, real access, hospital system-level access, and it takes motive. Nobody fabricates 2 entire pregnancies for fun, Althea. Somebody needed this story to exist on paper. The question is why. Althea sat very still, one hand resting, as it had begun to rest almost unconsciously in these last weeks, against the small, still flat curve of her stomach. The one real pregnancy in this entire nightmare. The one truth in a life that had apparently been rewritten by someone else's hand for years without her knowledge. Unless, she said slowly, an idea rising cold and unwelcome from somewhere in the back of her mind, someone needed a reason for me to disappear. A medical reason. A woman with a history like that. Unstable. Traumatized. If I ever turned up somewhere confused, or hurt, or dead, that record would already be there, waiting to explain it away. Nobody would ask questions about a woman with that history. Priya went very quiet. That's not paranoia talking, she finally said. That's exactly the kind of thing a person builds when they are preparing to erase somebody and need the paperwork to already agree with the story before it happens. It was Priya, 3 days later, who insisted on the toxicology consult, a specialist she knew from a previous case, a soft-spoken forensic toxicologist named Dr. Marguerite Cole, who reviewed old insurance-mandated blood work from a company retreat Althea had attended 2 years earlier, a weekend she barely remembered attending at all. Dr. Cole read the old lab results twice before she looked up. There are markers here, she said carefully, consistent with a short-acting sedative. Something that metabolizes quickly, doesn't always show up unless you're specifically looking for it, which, at the time, whoever ran your annual physical clearly wasn't. You wouldn't have felt intoxicated the way you'd expect. You'd have felt tired, foggy, maybe like you'd had one too many glasses of wine, even if you hadn't had any at all. The retreat, Althea said slowly, a chill spreading through her chest as pieces she hadn't known were missing began, horribly, to slot together. I don't remember most of that weekend. I remember arriving. I remember almost nothing from the second night onward until we flew home the next morning. I always thought I don't know, overslept. Cassian said I'd had too much champagne. How many days, would you say, I'm missing? Althea's mouth had gone dry. 3, she whispered. There are 3 days I can't account for at all. Dr. Cole set the lab report down gently, the way a person sets something down when they understand its weight. 3 days is a long time to lose, Mrs. Thorne. Long enough to do quite a lot to a person, if someone wanted to. Long enough to fabricate an entire alternate version of a life, if you had the right access, and you knew exactly what you were building toward. Outside the window of Dr. Cole's office, a gray winter sky pressed low over the city, and somewhere in that vast indifferent skyline, a man sat in a private office reviewing a file with Althea's photograph clipped to the front, a file that had been open, waiting, patient, for 18 months. He had been very careful. He had not expected her to survive long enough to start asking questions. Soren Vale had watched all of it unfold from a careful distance, the surveillance reports arriving on his desk each evening like chapters of a novel he couldn't stop reading. The DMV, the apartment, the hospital records. Each report made his jaw tighten a little further, each one confirming what his instinct had told him back in that ballroom on Christmas Eve, that whatever this was, it had started long before anyone staged a public divorce for the cameras. He hadn't returned the ultrasound. He told himself, at first, that he was waiting for the right moment, though the truth was messier than that. Some part of him wasn't ready to explain how he'd come to have it, wasn't ready to watch her face when she realized a stranger had known about her pregnancy before her own husband did. But when the surveillance team flagged unusual activity, a black SUV logged outside her hotel 3 nights running. A man photographed twice near her lawyer's office who matched no employee, client, or delivery record anyone could find. Soren decided waiting was no longer an option. He arranged to see her without announcing why, using the thin pretext of a foundation donor he claimed had asked about her well-being, and met her at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from Priya's office, deliberately public, deliberately safe. She recognized him the moment she sat down. "You're the man from the gala," she said, wary, exhausted in a way that made her look 10 years older than her photographs, and somehow, to Soren, more real than any image of her he'd seen splashed across a screen. "The one standing by the windows. I remember thinking you looked like you didn't want to be there." "I didn't," he admitted. "I came as a favor to a business partner. I stayed because of you." Her eyes narrowed, guarded, the reflex of a woman who had spent the last month learning that everyone in her orbit might be lying to her. "Because of me." He reached into his jacket, slower than necessary, giving her time to see exactly what he was doing, and set the cream envelope on the table between them. "You dropped this," he said, "the night of the gala. I've been carrying it around because I didn't know how to give it back to you without it seeming like." He exhaled. "I didn't want you to think I'd been going through your things. But I also didn't think it should sit in a drawer somewhere while people who might mean you harm are following you." Althea stared at the envelope like it might bite her. Slowly, she opened it, and the breath went out of her when she saw the ultrasound inside, the tiny curled shape she'd been carrying like a secret weapon against the wreckage of her old life. "You know," she said quietly, "it wasn't a question." "I know," Soren said, "and I know your husband doesn't." I could see it on his face that night. He wasn't performing shock about a pregnancy, because there wasn't any shock to fake. He genuinely has no idea. Althea's hand curled around the envelope. "Why does that matter to you?" "Because," Soren said, and here his voice dropped, quieter, more careful, the voice of a man choosing each word like it cost something. "I don't think your husband is the one who orchestrated any of this. Not the vanished identity. Not the fabricated medical records. Not whatever's been following you for the last 3 weeks." He watched that land, watched her go very still. "I think Cassian Thorne is a man being used by someone with far more patience and far more resources than he has. I think that gala performance was theater, a distraction, meant to humiliate you loudly enough that nobody would look closely at what was happening quietly, underneath it. And I think whoever's really behind this did not expect you to still be alive by now." Althea sat back slowly, the coffee in front of her long since gone cold, untouched. Outside the window, the city moved on, indifferent, unaware that at this small table a woman was hearing, for the first time, the shape of the conspiracy that had swallowed her entire life. "Who would want to erase me that badly?" she whispered. "I'm nobody. I don't run anything. I don't sit on any boards. I was just his wife." Soren's expression darkened, and for a moment something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like grief. "That," he said, "is exactly the question I intend to find the answer to. And I don't think you're going to like where it leads." He was right. He had no idea yet how right. Because 2 floors below the very cafe where they sat, in a black car idling at the curb, the man in the dark coat lifted a phone to his ear once more. "They've met," he said. Vale gave her the ultrasound. A long pause on the other end. Then, finally, the same unhurried, chilling voice. "Then it's time to accelerate the timeline. Bring in Cassian. Let him play his part a little longer. He's useful yet. But watch the Vale money. If he starts pulling threads, I want to know before he pulls the one that leads to me." Cassian Thorne did not, in fact, know he was being watched by the same man he answered to. He sat in his private office on the 40th floor of Thorne Tower 3 days after the coffee shop meeting he had no knowledge of, staring at a wire transfer confirmation he did not fully understand, the kind of number that should have made him feel powerful and instead made something cold twist low in his stomach. $800 million, routed through 4 shell entities in the last 6 months alone, all bearing his signature, none of which he clearly remembered authorizing in the detail the paperwork suggested. He had always told himself he ran his empire. Lately, in quiet moments like this one, alone with numbers that didn't add up, a small and unwelcome voice had begun asking him whether that had ever actually been true. His assistant buzzed through. "So, Mr. Drax is here. He says it's urgent." Cashin's shoulders tightened, an old, practiced reflex. "Send him in." The man who entered was unremarkable in the particular way that only extraordinarily dangerous men manage to be. Mid-50s, silver hair combed with surgical precision, a gray suit that cost more than most people's cars, a smile that never once reached the flat gray calm of his eyes. Lucien Drax had been, for as long as Cassian could remember, a quiet fixture at the edges of his father's business, then his own, a consultant, an advisor, a man who appeared at every major decision with calm suggestions that somehow always turned out to be correct, and who had never once, in 20 years, asked for public credit. Cassian had always assumed that made him trustworthy. He had never once asked himself why a man that skilled, that connected, that quietly powerful, would be content staying invisible for 2 decades. "You look troubled," Lucien said, settling into the chair across from Cashin's desk without waiting to be asked, the easy comfort of a man who had sat in that exact spot 1,000 times before. "The gala went well, I trust. Clean, efficient, exactly as we discussed." "The transfers," Cassian said, tapping the confirmation on his screen. "These figures don't match what I remember approving." Lucien's smile didn't waver. "You approved everything I put in front of you, Cassian. That's how this has always worked. I handle the architecture. You handle the face of it." He leaned forward slightly. "That arrangement has made you extraordinarily wealthy for 20 years. I'd think carefully before you start questioning the mechanics now. Of all times." "Of all times," Cassian repeated, an edge creeping into his voice that surprised even him. "Meaning what?" "Meaning your wife is asking questions she shouldn't be capable of asking," Lucien said, and for the first time, something colder slid beneath the pleasant surface of his voice. "Meaning a man named Soren Vale has taken an inconvenient interest in her welfare. Meaning the timeline we built this operation around, the quiet, clean timeline where Althea Thorns simply fade from relevance after a very public, very humiliating divorce, is no longer quiet and no longer clean." Cassian felt something shift in his chest, a slow, sick dawning. "What operation?" Lucien studied him for a long moment, the way a man studies a tool to decide whether it's finally outlived its usefulness. "You still think this was about a divorce," he said, almost gently. "You still think I helped you stage a humiliating breakup because I care about your marriage, or your pride, or your image." "Cassian." He shook his head slowly. "Your wife's identity has been systematically dismantled for 18 months. Her assets redirected. Her medical history rewritten. Her legal existence terminated in 3 separate federal databases. That is not a divorce strategy. That is an extraction. An extraction of what?" "Of everything she never knew she carried," Lucien said quietly. "Her father's estate held assets neither of you were ever told about. Offshore trusts, dormant shell corporations, holdings tied to interests I have spent 20 years quietly acquiring, one shadow company at a time. Her name, Cassian, was the last signature standing between me and full, permanent, untraceable control of those assets. All I needed was for Althea Thorn to legally cease to exist before anyone thought to look closely at what she was actually worth." Cassian stared at him, and something in his carefully constructed world, the marriage he'd treated as furniture, the empire he believed was his, began, quietly, catastrophically, to crack. "You used me," he said slowly. "I built you," Lucien corrected, standing, buttoning his jacket with unhurried precision. "I built your father's fortune before you were old enough to understand what money was. I built the version of you that sat on that stage and humiliated a pregnant woman in front of 300 cameras because I told him it would keep the world attention exactly where I needed it. On the 2 of you, on the scandal, on anything except the paperwork moving quietly in the background." He paused at the door and glanced back with something almost like pity. "You were never the mastermind here, Cassian." You are only ever the face. I'd have thought, after 20 years, you would have noticed. He left Cassian alone in an office 40 floors above a city that had no idea, yet, how much was about to come crashing down. An empire built on a lie so old and so carefully maintained that even the man whose name was on the door had never once suspected he was only ever a mask for someone else's fortune. For the first time in his adult life, Cassian Thorne understood, with a cold and absolute clarity, that he was afraid. Not for himself, for Althea, for the child he hadn't even known existed until Lucien Drax mentioned it in passing, offhand, cruel, everything she never knew she carried. And Cassian realized, with sickening speed, that Lucien knew about the pregnancy before he did. Which meant Lucien had known for weeks. Which meant, whatever came next, it had already been decided long before Cassian had any say in it at all. Kaelis Arden reappeared in Althea's life on a Tuesday, standing outside Priya Okafor's office building in the cold, unremarkable in a wool coat, watching the door with the patience of a man who had waited a very long time for this exact moment. Althea nearly walked past him. It had been 8 years, and grief does strange things to memory. She had spent so long training herself not to picture his face that when she finally saw it, older, weathered, more careful around the eyes, it took her a full 3 seconds to understand she wasn't imagining him. Kaelis, she breathed. The world before Cassian had had a different shape entirely. A smaller apartment, a smaller life, and a man named Kaelis Arden who had loved her without a single cent to his name. Back when she was simply a graduate student and he was an investigative researcher chasing corporate fraud stories nobody wanted to publish. They had been engaged, once, briefly, gloriously, before he vanished without a word 8 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a note that made no sense and a silence that had taken her years to stop aching over. She had told herself, eventually, that he'd simply been a coward, that he'd gotten cold feet and run. It had been easier to believe that than to sit with the alternative, that something had happened to him, and she would never know what. I need you to know something before you decide whether to ever speak to me again, Kaelis said now, his voice rough, urgent, glancing past her down the street with the reflexive wariness of a man who had spent years being careful. I didn't leave you. I was paid to disappear. Or rather, I was told, very clearly, by 2 men I never saw again, that if I didn't disappear, you would be the one who paid for it. I believed them. I had every reason to believe them. So I left the note, and I left the city, and I spent 8 years trying to build enough evidence to come back and prove I hadn't simply abandoned you. Althea stood frozen on the sidewalk, the cold air burning in her lungs, an old wound tearing back open in real time. Cassian, she said slowly. It was Cassian. It was Cassian's money, Kaelis said. But it wasn't Cassian's plan. I've spent 8 years chasing the actual architecture behind it, Althea, and I promise you, your husband barely understands what has been a part of. There's a man above him, above all of this, who has been quietly consolidating stolen assets under fabricated identities for 2 decades. Your father's estate is part of it. I think you are part of it. And I think, now that you're asking questions publicly, he's running out of time to finish what he started 18 months ago. Finish what? Althea whispered, though some cold, primal part of her already knew the answer before he said it. Kaelis looked at her with the exhausted, protective urgency of a man who had spent 8 years preparing for exactly this conversation. Erasing you, he said. Permanently, this time, not just your paperwork. You. Behind them, unnoticed, a black sedan slowed at the corner, idled for exactly 4 seconds, and pulled away. Somewhere across the city, in an office with a view of everything and a man in it who had made a career out of disappearing other people's inconvenient truths, a phone rang once. Arden's back, the voice on the other end reported. Is talking to her. Lucien Drax set down his pen very slowly, and for the first time in 18 months of flawless, patient execution, something like real urgency entered his voice. Then we moved tonight. The night Lucien Drax decided to move was the same night a light snow began to fall over the city, soft and indifferent, the kind of snow that made the world look gentler than it actually was. Althea didn't go back to her hotel. Something in Kaelis' face on the sidewalk had told her, without him needing to say it twice, that the version of safety she'd been clinging to for the last 3 weeks had just expired. Priya arranged a different location within the hour, a private security apartment owned by a client of hers, off the books, the kind of place that didn't exist in any lease record anyone could trace. Soren Vale's security team quietly took up positions on the block without being asked, because by now Soren had stopped waiting for permission to protect a woman he barely knew and could not stop thinking about. It was there, past midnight, in a borrowed apartment with the blinds drawn and a cup of tea going cold in her hands, that Althea finally let herself cry. Not for the marriage. Not even, entirely, for the 8 lost years with Kaelis. She cried because for the first time since Christmas Eve, she let herself feel the full, staggering weight of what it meant that somewhere out there, a man she had never met had spent 18 months meticulously planning her disappearance, and that the only reason she was still breathing was a stranger who happened to glance down and see an envelope hit a ballroom floor. "You're not alone in this," Soren told her quietly, sitting across the small kitchen table, close enough to offer comfort, careful enough not to crowd her. "I know that probably doesn't mean much from a man you've known 3 weeks. But you have people now. Kaelis, Priya, me. Whatever Lucian Drax thinks is finishing tonight, he's about to find out he waited too long. You're not the isolated, unprotected woman he was counting on anymore." Althea looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed, exhausted, and something in her chest, something that had been braced and clenched for 3 straight weeks, loosened, just slightly, for the first time. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked again, the same question from the coffee shop, except this time she genuinely wanted the real answer. Soren was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way he chose everything, carefully, deliberately. "Because I've spent my whole career watching powerful men build empires on other people's silence," he said. "My own father did something similar, on a smaller scale, to a business partner who trusted him. I watched what it did to that man's family. I swore I'd never stand by and watch it happen again if I had the power to do something about it." He met her eyes, and because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, this stopped being about doing the right thing, and started being about you specifically. "I'm not going to pretend that isn't true." Althea didn't answer that. She didn't need to. But she didn't pull her hand away when he reached across the table and covered it gently with his own. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and relentless, and neither of them noticed the SUV that idled for 11 minutes at the mouth of the alley before finally, reluctantly, pulling away. Lucian's men, testing the perimeter, finding it far better guarded than expected, and reporting back to a man who did not tolerate delays well. The labor came 6 weeks early, on a bitter February morning, in the middle of a deposition Priya had scheduled to formally document the fraud for federal investigators. Althea felt the first sharp pull low in her belly halfway through answering a question about the falsified apartment sale, and for a moment she thought it was simply stress, simply the accumulated weight of months finally cashing in on her body. By the second contraction, 4 minutes later, Priya was already on the phone with an ambulance, her professional composure cracking for the first time in the entire case. "It's too early," Althea gasped, gripping the arm of the chair, terror sharpening every syllable. "It's 6 weeks early. It's not supposed to." "You're going to be fine," Priya said, kneeling beside her, gripping her hand hard enough to anchor her. "Both of you are going to be fine." Soren arrived at the hospital 11 minutes after the ambulance, having broken every traffic law in the city to do it, and stood outside the delivery room for 6 of the longest hours of his life, pacing a hallway that had seen 1,000 anxious fathers do exactly the same thing. While somewhere behind those doors a woman he had known for barely a month fought to bring a child into a world that had already tried, twice now, to erase her. The baby, a boy, small but fierce-lunged, with a full head of dark hair and Althea's exact stubborn chin, arrived just after 4 in the afternoon. And for a brief, golden hour, the conspiracy, the erased identity, the vanished fortune, all of it fell away, and there was only a mother and a son and the astonishing, uncomplicated fact of a heartbeat that had, against every odd stacked against it, made it into the world. The hour didn't last. Because 6-week early births require routine testing, blood panels, genetic screenings, standard protocols any premature infant undergoes, and it was during that testing, late that same night, that a young resident frowned at a set of lab results, checked them twice, and then called for her supervising physician with a note of confusion in her voice that quickly sharpened into something closer to alarm. "I need you to look at this," she said, sliding 2 files side by side across the desk. "This is the infant's DNA panel, and this is the mother's blood type and genetic marker profile from her hospital record on file. They are not just inconsistent. They are not related. According to this chart, this woman has never given birth to this child. Genetically, biologically, it's impossible. Except I watched her deliver him myself 6 hours ago." The senior physician studied both files for a long, silent moment, and then looked up with the particular unease of a man realizing he was standing at the edge of something far larger than a simple lab error. "Pull every record this hospital has on file for Althea Thorne," he said quietly. "All of it, going back as far as the system allows." What came back, over the following 2 days, was a discrepancy that would eventually blow the entire conspiracy wide open. Every DNA sample on record for Althea Thorne, from the fabricated miscarriage 2 years prior, from the fabricated termination, from insurance blood work going back nearly 2 years, matched a single, consistent genetic profile. None of it matched Althea. Someone, at some point roughly 18 months earlier, had quietly substituted an entirely different woman's biological data into Althea's medical identity across every database that fed into it: insurance records, hospital systems, even, investigators would later discover with a chill that took days to fully process, into a National Health Archive used for federal identity verification. It wasn't merely that Althea's paperwork had been erased. It was that someone else's DNA had been layered in underneath her name, a ghost identity built so thoroughly that if Althea had ever died under mysterious circumstances during those 18 months, any forensic identification would have quietly, officially, confirmed she was someone else entirely. Someone whose death would raise no questions, because on paper, Althea Thorne simply wasn't real anymore. "This isn't identity theft," the lead FBI forensic analyst told Priya and Soren 3 days later. In a conference room littered with files, the fluorescent lights harsh against everyone's exhausted faces. "This is identity replacement, executed at a level of access I've genuinely never seen in 20 years of doing this work. Someone with this kind of reach into hospital systems, federal databases, and financial institutions simultaneously isn't an individual actor. This is a network, and whoever's running it has been doing this, to someone, for a very long time. Mrs. Thorne may not be the first person this happened to." That single sentence landed heavier than anything else in the room. She may not be the first. Somewhere out there, buried under other people's names, other people's stolen fortunes, there might be other women, other victims, whose lives have been quietly hollowed out and repurposed long before anyone noticed they were gone. Althea, still weak from delivery, her newborn son asleep in a bassinet beside a hospital bed, listened to all of this with a fury that burned cleaner and hotter than the fear that had carried her through the last 2 months. "Then we find him," she said quietly, and there was something new in her voice now. Not the brittle composure of the woman who'd walked off that ballroom stage, but something forged, something that had survived being told, by federal systems, that she didn't exist and had decided, in response, to become undeniable. "Whoever did this to me, whoever's done it to other women, we find him, and we make sure the entire world sees exactly what he did." If you've made it this far, you already know this story is about to reach the moment everyone's been waiting for: the unmasking. Before we get there, tell me in the comments, did you already suspect who the real villain was, or did this twist catch you completely off guard? Hit like if this story has kept you gripped from the very first scene, and subscribe now, because what happens in the next 10 minutes is the reason this story exists. The federal case against the Thorne Financial Network moved with unusual speed once the DNA discrepancy became a matter of record. What had begun as a personal nightmare for one woman had, almost overnight, become a sprawling multi-agency investigation. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division, Interpol liaising on the offshore holdings Kaelis had spent 8 years documenting, and a grand jury quietly convened to determine exactly how deep the fraud actually ran. Cassian Thorne was the first to fall. He didn't fight it. That surprised almost everyone who had followed the case. The assumption being that a man like Cassian, proud, image-obsessed, accustomed to buying his way out of consequences, would deploy every lawyer his fortune could hire to delay the inevitable. Instead, 3 weeks after Lucien Drax's visit to his office, Cassian walked into a federal courthouse flanked by his attorneys and did something none of them advised. He confessed. Not fully, not cleanly, but enough. "I want to be clear about something," he said, standing before the judge, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been in weeks, stripped of the performative warmth that had made him so effective on stages and cameras his entire adult life. "I participated in humiliating my wife publicly. I signed documents I didn't fully understand. I was, for most of my adult life, exactly the kind of man the world assumed I was. Vain, careless, more concerned with my image than the people standing beside me. I will answer for that." He paused, and something flickered across his face. Not quite remorse, but the beginning of it, the first honest thing Cassian Thorne had allowed the public to see in years. "But I wasn't protecting myself when I signed those divorce papers on that stage," he continued. "I was protecting someone else. A man who built my father's fortune before I understood what money was, and who made it very clear to me, in ways I am only now willing to say out loud, what would happen to my wife if I didn't play the part exactly as he'd scripted it." The courtroom had gone utterly silent. "His name is Lucien Drax," Cassian said. "And everything you're investigating, the identity fraud, the offshore accounts, the falsified medical records, all of it traces back to him. I was the face. He was always the architect. I should have understood that a long time ago. I'm sorry that it took almost losing everything for me to finally say his name out loud." At that exact moment, and later, investigators would establish this was not coincidence but design, a final desperate move by a man who had never once in 20 years allowed himself to be caught unprepared. The courtroom security cameras went dark. Then the lights. For 11 seconds, the room sat in confused, murmuring blackness, security personnel fumbling toward backup generators, the judge calling for order into a darkness that swallowed the sound. When the lights flickered back on, Lucien Drax was standing at the back of the courtroom, calm, immaculate, his gray suit unwrinkled, as though he had simply materialized rather than walked in through doors that should have been guarded. "Forgive the theatrics," he said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. Pleasant, almost warm, the voice of a man entirely unbothered by the federal marshals already reaching for their weapons. "But I did want to be here for this part. It seemed only fair, given how much of the story is mine." Every head in the courtroom turned. Althea, seated in the gallery beside Soren, felt her whole body go rigid at the sight of him. This quiet, unremarkable-looking man who had spent 18 months methodically erasing her existence from every database in the country, standing there now with the easy, untroubled posture of a man attending a mildly interesting lecture. "I've erased better people than you," Lucien said, and though his eyes never left Cassian, everyone in that room understood the words weren't really meant for him. "I built fortunes out of thin air and buried the evidence so deep that men far smarter than any federal analyst spent decades never finding it. You didn't beat me. You simply happened to be standing close enough to watch it fall apart, and mistook proximity for victory." He smiled, the same pleasant, terrible smile he'd worn in Cassian's office months earlier. "I'll see everyone at the next hearing," he said, and turned, unhurried, toward the doors, as though he still believed, even now, surrounded by federal marshals in a courtroom full of witnesses, that he would simply walk out the way he'd walked in. He was wrong. Someone was already moving. Not toward Lucien. He'd anticipated that reflex would get him nowhere against a man surrounded by marshals. But toward the side exit he knew, from 3 months of quietly studying this building's layout, connected to the underground parking structure. He'd learned, over these last months, exactly how men like Lucien Drax thought. They never walked into a room without a second door already planned. He was right to move. By the time marshals reached the main doors, Lucian was gone, slipped through a service corridor during the chaos of his own theatrical exit, into a car waiting exactly where Soren had guessed it would be. The chase that followed made every evening news broadcast in the country. Federal vehicles, a private security convoy assembled in under 6 minutes by a furious Soren Vale, converging on an abandoned private airport terminal on the city's outskirts, the last known property still registered. Barely, buried under 6 shell companies, to Lucian Drax. Soren reached him first. He found Lucian standing alone on the cracked tarmac beside a small jet that would never take off, the winter wind cutting across the empty runway, federal helicopters already visible as distant lights in the darkening sky. "You think you've won," Lucian said, and for the first time, something genuinely rattled had crept into his composure. Not fear, not exactly, but the disbelief of a man who had never once, in 20 years, been outmaneuvered. "You have no idea what you're standing in the middle of, Mr. Vale. This network extends further than your imagination allows. Erase me, and 3 more like me simply take my place." "Maybe," Soren said, standing his ground, unarmed and unafraid in a way that made Lucian's eyes narrow. "But you won't be one of them. And that starts tonight." That was when Kaelis Arden's car pulled onto the tarmac, headlights cutting through the dark, and Kaelis stepped out holding a small silver drive in one gloved hand. 8 years of documentation, offshore account trails, falsified identity records, testimony from 3 other victims Kaelis had spent nearly a decade quietly locating, women whose lives had been hollowed out by the same patient, invisible hand, women who had, until tonight, believed they were alone in their nightmare. 8 years, Kaelis said, walking toward Lucian with the steady, unhurried gait of a man who had waited far too long for this exact moment to rush it now. 8 years, tracking every shell company, every falsified death certificate, every stolen identity you built your empire on top of. This drive has all of it. Every name, every victim, every dollar. He held it up. You didn't just erase Althea. You erased dozens of people, over 20 years, and every single one of them is about to get their name back. Lucian Drax looked, for one brief and human moment, genuinely afraid. Then the federal helicopters landed, and the moment passed, and Lucian Drax, the invisible architect behind 2 decades of stolen fortunes and erased identities, was placed in handcuffs on a stretch of cracked tarmac under a cold February sky, his empire collapsing in real time as agents fanned out to secure the jet, the terminal, and the small silver drive that would, over the following months, unravel every shadow company he had ever built. The trial that followed lasted the better part of a year. Cassian Thorne, in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony, avoided the harshest charges but lost nearly everything else. The fortune, revealed to have been almost entirely architecture built by Lucian over 2 decades, dissolved into restitution funds for identity fraud victims across 4 states. He gave one final interview after sentencing, quiet, subdued, a man who had spent his whole life performing confidence finally speaking without a script. "I don't ask anyone to forgive what I did on that stage," he said. "I only hope, someday, my son knows I tried to make it right, even if I understood far too late what right actually required of me." Lucian Drax was convicted on federal charges spanning identity fraud, financial conspiracy, and, in a detail that made national headlines for weeks, accessory charges related to the disappearance of at least 2 other women whose falsified deaths, investigators eventually confirmed, had not been fabrications at all. He would spend the remainder of his life in federal prison, still, according to those who interviewed him, insisting with quiet, chilling calm that the network he'd built would outlast his conviction. Investigators are still working to determine whether he was right. 6 months later, the Vesper Foundation opened its doors on a bright spring morning, in a converted brownstone 3 block from the courthouse where it had all finally come undone. Althea stood on the front steps, her son Caius asleep against her shoulder, watching a small crowd of reporters and, more importantly, a handful of quiet, hopeful strangers, women who had read her story, women who recognized in it a version of their own, gather at the entrance. The foundation existed for exactly this purpose, to help victims of identity fraud and financial erasure reclaim what had been taken from them, to fund the kind of investigative and legal support that had once taken Priya Okafor and an unlikely coalition of allies to assemble by hand. Soren stood beside her, not for the cameras, not for any performance, simply because, somewhere in the 8 months since a ballroom floor and a dropped envelope, he had become the kind of steady, patient presence in her life that she had never once had before, and never asked to prove it with grand gestures. He didn't need the stage. He never asked for one. Their relationship had grown slowly, deliberately, built on the unglamorous, unshakable foundation of trust rather than rescue. Two people who had chosen each other, in the aftermath of everything, without either of them needing the other to be a solution to their damage. Kaelis published his investigation 11 weeks after the trial concluded, a sprawling, meticulously sourced expose that named every falsified identity Lucian Drax's network had ever built, that gave 3 other erased women their names and their stolen fortunes back, that shook financial institutions across 4 countries into long overdue audits of their own security. He gave no interviews about it. He didn't attend the Foundation's opening, though Althea knew, quietly, that he'd been the one to anonymously fund its first year of operating costs. A week after the story broke, he was gone again, not vanished the way he had been 8 years before, not running from anyone, simply choosing, this time on his own terms, a quieter life far from cameras that had never once been kind to him. Caius Thorne, though Althea had, in the months since, quietly begun the process of changing both their names, a fresh legal identity built this time entirely on her own terms rather than someone else's design, was healthy, thriving, and utterly unaware of how close he had come to being born into a story that had almost erased his mother before he ever took his first breath. It should have ended there, a clean epilogue. A woman who had survived the unimaginable, rebuilding a life on her own terms, surrounded by people who had chosen, again and again, to fight for her when the world had decided she was disposable. It nearly did. Then, on a rainy evening in early autumn, an unmarked package arrived at the Foundation's front desk, addressed simply to Althea in careful, elegant handwriting that matched nothing in her legal history, nothing in any record the FBI had ever pulled. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper gone soft with age, was a single faded photograph, a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, standing beside a woman Althea had never seen in her life, in front of a house she didn't recognize, the edges of the photograph worn smooth by years of handling. On the back, in the same careful fountain pen script, was written a single line that stopped her breath entirely. Your name was never Althea Vesper. That was only the second identity they gave you. She stood in the doorway of the foundation she had built to help women reclaim stolen lives, holding proof that her own story had begun somewhere much further back than she had ever imagined. That somewhere beneath the name she had spent her whole life believing was hers, there was another name, another woman, another erasure that had happened long before Lucian Drax ever learned her face. Outside, the rain kept falling, soft and relentless against the windows, and Althea looked up slowly, the photograph trembling slightly in her hand, understanding with a cold and quiet certainty that the story she had just survived was not, after all, the beginning. It was only the second chapter, the end, or the beginning. If this story gripped you the way it gripped everyone who worked on bringing it to life, don't let it end here. Comment the one moment that hit you hardest, whether it was the ballroom, the DNA test, or that final photograph, because we read every single one of them. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that the quietest people in the room are often the strongest. And if you want to know whose name Althea really carries before Lucian Drax ever touched her life, subscribe and turn on notifications, because that story is coming next, and it goes back further than anyone in this one ever imagined.